All right, Doug, we're here in person. It's first, maybe the third time we've done this in person.
And on top of that, we're in Uruguay.
I know, which is nice. And because we're not doing this over Zoom, we don't have to worry about internet connections.
All kinds of pluses. It's a plus being here in Uruguay. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so today, a couple things I want to talk about. First of all, clarification around something that we talked about with Rick Mayberry the other day. He had his 17-word solution on ethical behavior, and then you asked him about an abridged version of that, and there was some pushback. People didn't like it. So first, what's your version of it?
Right. Well, to reiterate, I thoroughly and completely agree with Rick's 17-word definition of what you need to live an ethical life. But shorter is generally better. And as I pointed out in the past, this is one of the problems with the Ten Commandments. As interested as I am in religion, I don't, and despite the fact that I went through religious schooling for, idiotically, 16 years, I'm not sure that I can reel off the Ten Commandments right now.
I can't.
I know the first three are your supposed obligations to Yahweh. Well, I toss those out as being of little value, but that's worth a discussion too. We could actually talk about the Ten Commandments sometime.
We should.
But so it's better to have two great laws that really encompass things the way Rick pointed out. But the reason that I said the whole of the law shall be do as thou wilt, which somebody pointed out quite correctly, that comes from Aleister Crowley, or at least he popularized that. But Crowley didn't add in, but be prepared to accept the consequences. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that when you think, look, first of all, everybody basically does what they want.
Yes.
I mean, they justify it, they rationalize it, but they wind up doing pretty much what they want. The problem is, nobody thinks, but be prepared to accept the consequences. In other words, they only think about maybe the immediate and direct consequences of doing what they want. Steal $1,000, hey, I got $1,000, that's pretty good. But they don't think about the indirect and delayed consequences. They don't think like an economist. But I guess the point that I'm really trying to make here, when we say be prepared to accept the consequences, it's that it causes you to accept personal responsibility for your actions. If you're prepared to accept the consequences, you're accepting responsibility. And if you act irresponsibly, that's a path to disaster. So I'll defend. Well, look, another point I want to make. It's that just like physicists are trying to take the laws of the universe down to one great law, okay, not just laws of electrodynamics and things like that. So it sums it up, I think.
Yeah, actually, I misunderstood what you meant by it. So as well, because I've always thought, since you said that for years, I thought that what you're more doing was describing the way the world actually functions rather than prescribing an ethical framework.
Yeah.
But when you add the fact that it's about responsibility, it is prescribing an ethical framework, which is to take responsibility for the decisions you make and the consequences of all those decisions. And by doing that, by taking extreme responsibility for your actions, you are more likely to conduct yourself in an ethical way.
Yeah, in other words, if you are irresponsible and don't take responsibility for what you do, what you're probably doing is causing a random chaos in the world, which is, generally not a good thing.
Not a good thing. Okay. All right. Well, good. Well, hopefully that clears it up for people.
It might, but
Might make people more mad.
Listen, I think it's a good idea if everybody thinks about, what's right and what's wrong and what works and what doesn't in conducting relationships with other people and ethics in society in general. And we can discuss these things. We could argue, maybe even disagree with each other on on things. I mean, not everybody's always right at all things.
Nope.
So anyway, I'm glad that some people, commented.
Yeah, I like it. I like the
Thought it was
pushback on it, honestly.
wrong. Yeah, exactly.
It's a good thing. So the one of the other things I wanted to talk about was you mentioned something in the car the other day. We were talking about some book you're reading, which sort of triggered this thinking in your mind that the parallels between the United States or the Western civilization today and Greece. Now, you're known for comparing Western civilization with Rome. Really.
Everybody does that. It's a cottage industry where everybody figures to do that. And incidentally, before we forget, I wrote a 10,000 word essay, so it's kind of a longish read.
But it's fantastic.
It's pretty good, I think, if I do say so myself. And
it's available for if people would like it. If they join our email list, I'll send them a copy of it.
yeah, I think it's actually worth reading. It's the version that I have. I've transcribed it into the form of a speech, but it's really the paper just with a couple of sentences that identify it as being a speech that I gave. Anyway, so comparing the U.S. to the collapse of Rome, everybody does it. I felt I had to do it too. It's kind of like a
Rite of passage.
yeah, exactly. It's like a term paper that you gotta do. But then it occurred to me that most people, I think, in the U.S. and in the West generally, know a lot more about Rome than they do about ancient Greece, because after all, Rome ran from the Republic, starting with, let's say, 500 BC up until the total collapse, 500 AD. And these numbers are both kind of squishy. Okay, but that's 1,000 years of history. So I guess people, and it's closer in time, so people spend more time on Rome than they do on Greece, because Greece really only had a century. Ancient Greece, the heart of it that was important, was really only a century. So it occurred to me, and I haven't thought this out completely, and maybe some of our listeners might have some things to add to this, but Greece first jumped out onto the scene of world history with the Battle of Marathon against the Persian Empire, but actually it started a little bit before that, because there were Greek cities all around the Mediterranean, about 1,500 city-states, actually, which is quite a few, with Greek populations all over the Mediterranean. But the Persian Empire, which was it was the superstate at that time, was moving into eastern Anatolia, which is where Turkey is today. And these were all Greek cities that that Cyrus was overwhelming. And, the Greeks in those cities went to the Athenians, who were the leading city-state even then, and asked for help. And the Athenians stuck their nose into the business, helping people that seemed to them to be friends. And, of course, that annoyed the Persians. So, I don't know, is there a lesson that we can take from this? Yeah, you want to help your friends, but on the other hand, when you stick your nose into other people's business in a foreign country, things might get complicated. And they did, because after the Athenians were instrumental in driving the Persians out of these cities in eastern Anatolia, the Persians decided to teach the Greeks a lesson, teach the Athenians a lesson. So they invaded, and their fleet landed at Marathon. Not a huge fleet, these are just a bunch of Greeks. Can't confront the empire. And the Athenians met them on the beach and won a great victory and bloodied their nose, and they went home. So 10 years later, you just can't take a defeat like that. So the Persians,
This was Thermopylae, right? Was this?
yes,
Yeah.
10 years later, this was 490 BC when Marathon occurred.
Oh.
And then in 480 BC, when the Persians reinvaded, but massively, they made a big deal out of it. They were going to conquer Greece. And that's where we had the Spartans at Thermopylae. And it wasn't just the Spartans, actually. We don't really know what the numbers are. These things are lost in the mists of history. They really are. But there were representatives of other Greek city-states there, hundreds, maybe thousands of other hoplites that were there at Thermopylae. But for some reason, the Spartans got all the credit. It wasn't just 300 guys standing against 100,000 or however many. Anyway, it was at Thermopylae, and then the Athenians fought a sea battle at Salamis, where they were also outnumbered, but they won. And so at that point, the Persians were pushed aside. And then the Athenians took the show on the road, and since the Persians were still a major danger to all the Greek cities at that point, but the Athenians were the leaders, and they were closest to Persia, and they were a sea power. They put together something that was called the Delian League.
Is it like a NATO of the day?
Kind of a NATO of the day. That's exactly what it was. And all of the other cities that were members of it had to contribute to it, and they kept the treasury for the Delian League, which was species. It was silver, basically. They kept it on the island of, well, it wasn't Lesbos. What was the island where they kept it? I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the island where they kept it.
But that was more neutral territory, right?
Neutral. That's right, neutral territory. Exactly. That was the point. But then, when Pericles, who's the most famous Greek politician of that era, was in office, thought, it's a better idea, safer to move the treasury here at Athens. And basically what the Athenians did is they misappropriated everybody's cash contributions, and they used it to build.
Okay, so they misappropriated everyone's cash contributions or silver contributions.
Yeah, and the Delian League turned from an alliance to protect against the Persians to basically a shakedown operation on the part of the Athenians. And they preferred that the other cities, instead of contributing hoplites and triremes to the defense operation commitments, just give us the cash and we'll take care of it for you. And incidentally, build up a big army that we can use to intimidate you. So it got pretty out of control. And there's a famous instance. There was an island called Milos that decided that we don't want to be a member of the Delian League, just include us out. And the Athenians invaded it, just totally destroyed the city, killed all the men, enslaved all the women and children. And, this is, not very in keeping with the enlightened
Right.
image that the Athenians were trying to prevail. And there was something that somebody said, I'm not quoting it exactly, but I pretty well got it. It's that the strong do what they want, and the weak do what they must. And that was their whole explanation of it. There was no moralizing or here's the reason why or anything. It's just, we're going to do it because we can do it. And we need the money, and we want to make an example. That was basically why they destroyed this island that didn't want to be their ally. So, in any event, the Spartans and the Athenians were always at each other's throats. And of course, the Spartans had a very, very different culture from the Athenians. But all these Greek cities were constantly fighting with each other. Anyway, they were always having wars against each other. But about the year 434 BC, now we're talking 60 years, more or less, after Marathon, and 50 years after Salamis and Thermopylae, the Peloponnesian War started in earnest. And that's a whole different story. That people have written whole books about the Peloponnesian War. And Thucydides, who was the first actual historian, people like to say Herodotus was the father of history. But his methodology of recounting history was basically, telling all he knew and recounting anecdotes and tales and so forth. But Thucydides, when he wrote an analysis of the Peloponnesian War, tried to adopt objective historical norms of telling the tale. In any event, the Peloponnesian War, and the Athenian, what happened is at some point, when did the Athenians launch their expedition against Syracuse? They rounded up 40,000 hoplites, which is a very large number considering the size of Athens and the cities of Greece at that point, and invaded Sicily, which was a long sail, because they had to sail along the coast, to Syracuse, which was the main Greek city. And anyway, it's a whole different story, like I said, but it turned into a disaster. Everybody got killed, everybody got captured, their fleet was sunk. It was a total and absolute catastrophe. And Athens never recovered from that. So what year was that? By the time it all came to a sad end, it was about the year 400, okay? Which incidentally is about when Socrates died, about the same year. And Plato came a little after that, and Aristotle came after that. Because you recall that the next big thing in Greek history is when the Macedonians, who the Greeks didn't really even want to consider Greeks, they were kind of northern barbarians that kind of speak our language, but not very well, under Philip, and then under Alexander the Great, came down. And, well, the Athenians they never recovered from the tremendous loss of capital and men and everything else from the Peloponnesian War. And the Spartans were on the slippery slope for other reasons, which is a different story. But anyway, then Alexander died in 330 BC. So this is kind of the timeline. It's kind of interesting that everything that happened in Greek history basically happened from roughly 500 BC with the Athenians helping out their buddies on the Anatolian Peninsula to Alexander. Well, it was actually Philip, but Alexander in 330 BC when he died.
Wow.
So,
what are the parallels to? How do you think that contrasts with today?
well, yeah, okay, that's kind of the background, and I don't know if there's more. I don't know if people are actually interested in hearing an off-the-cuff recantation of ancient Greek history.
I think they are, because I think our listeners are very interested in history, and they're very interested in these understanding today, and history helps them understand it.
And there are good things on YouTube where people give actual written lectures about these things that, go on for hours. So I'm just trying to summarize my take on 130 30 years of Greek history, which is basically
In 20
all of
minutes.
it. Yeah, exactly. And then I want to tie into that why I think that Greece or Athens, I should say, is as good a comparison to the collapse of the U.S. empire as the Romans are. And the Greeks were other than fighting among themselves, they weren't conquering. One of the causes for the Athenian success were the silver mines at Laurium. There were, it was a huge silver strike, and they were able to mint a lot of coins, and that helped. But it made Athens the center of the world for art, for literature, for politics. For that matter, because this idea of democracy, which was a very different thing in those days than it is today in our country, this was all in Athens. It made Athens the center, and if it was like going to Athens was like going to New York, and the Athenians, it was profitable having foreigners come there and spend money and so forth, like in New York. But eventually, they became too rich and too big for their britches, got into a nasty war that basically destroyed them from a capital and a moral point of view. Everything from, losing their ethical rudder with things like the destruction of the island of Milos and other examples like that, which we don't usually talk about because we like to say Athens was a city on the hill and the foundation of Western civilization, which is true. But,
But when they moved, I think the sign of it all is when they moved the treasury to Athens and start building monuments to themselves. It's kind of a sign at the top.
We can say mistakes were made.
Mistakes were made.
Yeah. So I think it's fair enough to look at Athens as being a template for the U.S. collapse. And in those days, I think it's worth pointing out that war was a profitable enterprise. I mean, much more so for the Romans. I mean, because when you invaded a foreign country, it was costly. You had to pay the soldiers, and it was expensive. But if you conquered the country, you got to steal the national treasury, you got to steal the artwork, you got to steal the cattle. You could enslave everybody, and slaves had a huge market value. And then later on, you could tax them every year in the form of tribute. So war was potentially a very profitable enterprise.
But they didn't get into it for profits at first, right? I mean, defending their allies or their friends at first.
No, they didn't. And that kind of sounds like you want to think, or at least in our mythology, we used to do things out of the goodness of our heart, but then we get into things where not the U.S. government doesn't profit directly, but our corporations, which are the minions of the U.S. government in today's world. And this is when we air the conversation we had with John Perkins. And when people watch that, they're going to say, well, wait a minute. Perkins has got values that are upside down and wrong. And, he's a member, or at least a wannabe member of the deep state, or an ex-member of the deep state that's kind of gone rogue in his own kind of hippie-type direction. I'll bet a lot of people are going to say, well, why didn't you guys counter him? And, well, I didn't feel like it because he's a kind of a guest in our house.
Yes.
And I don't like to...
trying to be polite.
Try to be polite. I don't like to get into disputations with people that are expecting a warm reception, and then you ambush them the way some scummy journalist might do. So,
well, I will say though that there were a lot of parts where you were pushing back on him, and during the conversation, but
well, I tried to be polite and do it in the form of asking questions as opposed to making accusations.
Yeah.
But in any event, the U.S. Government, by giving aid to foreign aid, and I don't even know what the numbers are right now. It used to be 30 or 40 or 50 billion. I don't know what it's bloomed up to now.
I can imagine it would be 10 times that.
It could be, yeah. And that aid, basically, they have to buy stuff from American corporations. So it's from the American taxpayer to a foreign government.
Allegedly, it doesn't really go to them, according to John Perkins. Even.
No, that's right, because a lot of it's just skimmed right off the top and goes straight to Switzerland through its leaders. But then what's left, if there's any building to be done of infrastructure, everybody likes infrastructure, it goes to the American corporations who give money to the party that gives the foreign aid and all that. So it's very corrupt. So Perkins is quite correct about that. But then it occurred to me, because I read an article about China's Belt and Road Initiative, which seems to be coming unglued at this point. They, unlike the Americans, the government who gives money under the terms we just discussed to various foreign countries, the Chinese make loans, much more intelligent. But then the loans carry interest, and the reason these countries are undeveloped and have no infrastructure is because they don't have they don't have the things that made Western civilization great. They don't think in terms of free thought and free speech and entrepreneurialism and free market capitalism and things like that. They're basically all little dog shit dictatorships. And so, of course, when the Chinese build a port or build a railroad, it's mismanaged and poorly run. And that's why a lot of these countries aren't able to pay their loans. And the Chinese think it's okay because then they take over the asset.
Which might be the goal from the beginning.
It may be, and it might be a great way to send in thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Chinese to maintain it and run it properly and become citizens of the country and export their, down at the heels portion of their population.
Sounds like they're colonizing.
Yeah, because years ago, some Chinese general said, we'd like to export about 200 or 300 million people to Africa.
Wow.
So, and it makes all the sense in the world. Maybe he said that before they realized that the Chinese population itself is
collapsing.
It's collapsing, and by the end of this century, estimates are that it can fall from 900 million to 600 million people.
Yeah, I saw 40% was the number I saw.
Yeah. So, all these grandiose plans that states come up with always come to nothing. So, my question is notwithstanding the tremendous success, well, I'll give you an example of what happens to foreign aid, whether it's the American type or the Chinese type of foreign aid. I mean, this really sticks in my mind. When I went to Cameroon, one of the more obscure places in Africa, about 20 years ago, we landed in the airport, and it was obvious that this airport had been built state-of-the-art technology. I don't know how many years before. But, they had the jetways, which didn't work, so we had to get off the plane with,
like you normally do.
A roll-up stairway. But we got to take a look at the jetways. None of the machinery worked. It was all dirty and decrepit. The airport itself was dirty and decrepit. And it was pristine when the French built it for them, obviously. And that's what's happening, I think, with, not only most of the aid that actually is invested in these countries that the Americans give, but the Belt and Road projects, too. So, of course, the Chinese, to defend their investment, want to send in properly programmed, efficient, educated Chinese workers, which also has the bonus of altering the demographics of the country. And
right.
Yeah. So the Chinese are taking over Africa, and I promise you that the next couple of decades, the Africans are going to take over Europe for different reasons again. So
So what are the lessons from, I guess, from Athens, or the specific things that parallels, I guess, that you can state that like their actions are a lot like when the U.S. did X?
well, so yeah, what are the lessons that we can learn from these
Clearly,
things?
the foreign wars, and I mean, obviously they were foreign wars, all of them, I guess. Even
Yeah,
Peloponnesian wars.
war is the health of the state, that's for sure, but it'll destroy the state in the end. It's a question of looking at the short-run benefits of looting and stealing and pillaging and rapine and so forth, but in the long run, it just never ever works out. I mean, I guess that's the lesson, but it has to do with the idea of the state itself, and I'm afraid most people they think that the world not only does but should revolve around the government and the state much more now than it was ever the case in the past. I mean, we expect the government to do things today, and the government's not good at anything, frankly, but taxing and inflating and fighting wars, not even good at that, quite frankly.
No.
So,
Well, there's something about the when you think about economics, states as they kind of reach their peak, that happened when the Pericles was there, when they misappropriated the treasury and they started spending on all these monuments. It just seems like they lost, like that's a sign of losing your way, taking the capital that you have that's supposed to serve a certain purpose and basically using it on, while I really appreciate all the ruins around Greece. I mean,
Yeah.
It's really great. I mean, Parthenon is great. It's great.
yeah.
But it was definitely probably not the best use of people's money, and certainly wasn't what they intended when they gave it to the state.
No, it wasn't. Same thing is true of the pyramids. I mean, I'm glad they're there, quite frankly, but it wasn't a productive use of capital.
No.
So-
And so we have a few examples of that, certainly, with the U.S.
Yeah, I guess we will have our own set of pyramids. And the thing is, I don't think the U.S. The problem with the U.S. is it's not maintaining any of the latter-day pyramids that we've built in terms of government buildings.
Well, not just government buildings, but I mean, the infrastructure in the U.S. is awful. I mean, when I was driving across the country to your place in Virginia, it's unbelievable how bad the roads were.
Well,
Unbelievable.
The problem is that all the roads in the U.S. are basically owned by the state. So what they should be, and what they were initially, is toll roads, where the proprietor of the toll road not only finances it, didn't cost anybody anything to build the toll road, but it's self-sustaining. And it keeps traffic down to reasonable levels because you got to pay for what you use. So the state shouldn't own any of this infrastructure. But what are they doing? Biden's building more infrastructure, and it's all state-owned infrastructure, which won't be maintained or built economically, or it's the problem is that everything revolves around the state, and ideally things should revolve around the individual or voluntary groups of individuals, like corporations, which have turned out to be totally corrupt because they're all hooked up with the state. They're all minions of the state, slopping at the state's trough and feeding at its tits. So it's a bad situation, and I don't see what can improve it at this point. And when you reach a certain point, just as Athens did and Sparta did for different reasons, the whole Greek civilization did, and later the Roman civilization did, we're absolutely on the same path right now.
At a certain point, there's really nothing that can be done.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Well, I guess you could change things, but these things have a life of their own.
Right. Could anyone change things, really? I mean, it just seems like there's so many there's just, well, you wouldn't even know where to begin. You know, the rot is so deep. It needs to be flushed down the toilet and start over.
Exactly. And members of the deep state, so-called, that are profiting from things the way they are right now would fight it all tooth and nail.
Right.
So I don't think you could. If Ron Paul had been elected, if he hadn't been assassinated after he got a sit down from the generals and the heads of the Praetorian agencies telling him the way things work, then the Congress would have impeached him, and the plebs would have rioted because he would have been taking away their doggy dishes,
Yep.
breaking their rice bowls. So
Even he wouldn't have been able to do it.
No.
Yeah.
now everybody's got a rice bowl that's related to the government, and nobody wants that rice bowl broken because they think it's going to keep being filled with rice forever.
So everything gets to a point where it's going to collapse, and basically this is like back to the interview we did with Rick. It's you just got to wait until it happens, and then you need to have hopefully some person with the fastest Jeep, who's like a Ron Paul, somebody like that of good character to step in and fill the empty offices after the people have fled.
Yeah, but things usually get worse when there's a collapse and
Yeah.
or a revolution. Because the guy that's got the fastest Jeep and takes over the reins of power,
Oh, here's Fidel.
if he wants to maintain his power, the way he's brought up, he thinks he's got to be even more brutal than the guy before. I mean, you talk about Fidel, one thing that we didn't get a chance to talk about with Rick is that, Batista, may have been, a bad guy, and he was, but Cuba was a really prosperous place at that point where, most of the peasants were educated, they could travel, they could improve themselves and so forth. And Fidel, but he used great PR, locked it down. And the same thing could happen in the US because everybody's going to clamor for a savior, somebody that says, look, I know how to fix this, we just need to do X, Y, and Z, tighten things up. It'll just be a lockdown for 2 weeks to flatten the curve, don't worry about it. So, if we have a real catastrophe economically, which we will, or of some other type, real or imagined, I think a strong man is going to take over and people will clamor for it. Kiss it and make it better. That's what the government's supposed to do.
Was there a strong man in Athens?
Well, the government in Athens evolved and changed over time, but politicians that would rise to the top the way Pericles did because they had more force of character, they spoke better, they knew how to manipulate people. But, it's not like Pericles was officially king of Athens. They didn't have a king.
Yeah.
It was just the leading citizen, basically. And I'm trying to think, because they changed things so much over the years. They had different councils and legislative bodies and so forth. And of course, in those days, the citizens of Athens, the reason why that democracy worked insofar as it did was that it was small enough that everybody kind of knew each other, at least by reputation, because you all came into Athens and there were these large meetings where everybody would, could say what he wanted, even though it was a giant crowd.
Yeah.
I don't really know how it would have worked from a practical point of view where you have this huge group of people, but it was a participatory democracy as opposed to our so-called democracy, which is a representative democracy, but it's not a democracy at all.
No, it's not. All right, well, I think we can leave it there for today.
Yeah,
And,
this is kind of miscellaneous ramblings about things that happened 2,500 years ago that actually nobody's totally sure what actually happened.
No, we can't be totally sure, but I think that's very interesting. I mean, when you were telling about, I'd heard before about Athens moving the treasury to Athens, but I didn't know I didn't know really what happened after that. I didn't realize it was Pericles, then used those funds to build all these monuments that we have today. I didn't know that any of that, and I certainly didn't, never thought of Athens as a parallel to the U.S. I mean, I did the Roman Empire, probably because of your influence, but
Well, I'm sure Pericles thought it was a good idea. It certainly made him the big man.
yeah, he's a guy who can spend all the money.
Yeah, I
He's
mean,
always a big man.
if you're in a public place, people are thinking politically. Everybody wants to be the big man responsible. I created that.
Yeah.
You didn't build it. I built that building.
Exactly right. All right, so we're going to do, for the next couple of days, we're going to do Q&As. So I'll leave a link in the description of this video. You can submit a question for those. The best way to do it is, though, to join our Telegram group. There's also a link for that in the description. Join the Telegram group, and I give those preference for answering order. So either way, submit your questions, and we'll get into them tomorrow and on Friday.
Yeah.
So thanks, Doug. I
It'll be
appreciate
fun.
it.
Thank you, Matt.